one. I've got my crystals with me, and I want to make some of these crystal sounds for you. Or I can break some of my rocks doing that, right? Alright, so as usual, we are going to start with setting our intention. I've already got the candles lit, so we'll start by putting our intention, sending our intention into the flame. And so I set the intention that tonight's reading accomplish the greatest and highest good only for all. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and clear our space. So I'm going to go ahead and move the book out of the way for this. There we go. Okay. We'll start with our water cleanse. Shake up that lavender oil in there that may have kind of sunk to the bottom. Because you know, oil and water don't mix too well. Okay, let's go ahead and hand sounds. Cannot do the finger flutters, guys. This is all I can do. Okay. Right, and now, just take a nice deep breath. Hold. Release. That essential oil, let the fragrance start to calm your nervous system. Alright, now for the smoke cleanse. Scarlet Letter to convey 4 important points about his story in the form of a long introductory essay, if you will. First, he sees it as a way to tell his personal autobiographical story of sorts. Second, his struggle with choosing a career or pursuing his passion, which is writing, right? So working as a government official or throwing himself into his writing, risking instability and thus unable to support a family. So that was that concern. Third, his perspective on romance novels, which he is later credited with mastering the technique and refining it. Fourth, the setting of the story in Salem, Massachusetts. In the 1600s, when the Puritans had just settled, he takes the reader to the custom house where he was an officer and describes how he came into possession of a Scarlet Letter A that inspired the story. We also learn that the Puritans founded this colony in the 1600s based on God's teachings and a commitment to follow his word. But these values were forgotten by the 1700s when commercialism and wealth became the priority. The drastically changing times are further explored by the old general of the custom house, who was revered as someone of high morals, compassion, and integrity. However, he had later been replaced by corrupt individuals who slept on the job, stole items for smuggling, and had a supervisor who was essentially incompetent and spineless. A third connection Hawthorne makes between the past and the present is his mention of his ancestors. And it's made very clear his dislike for the puritanical values of his ancestors, while he assumed they would feel the same toward him for his choices. To quote Hawthorne's description, he imagined them to believe him unsuccessful in their eyes, worthless and disgraceful, a writer of storybooks. Regardless, he feels an undeniable connection to Salem. While he acknowledges their blood relations, their values of intolerance and lack of humanity are the topic of this novel. So, let's get right into chapter 1. See, right there. And I'm using the crystals as like a little weight because, as you can see, the pages don't like to stay down very well. Oh, and this is an antique book that is 113 years old. Okay. A throng of bearded men in sack-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats intermixed with women, some wearing hoods and others bareheaded, was assembled in front of the wooden edifice, the door of which was heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. The founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery and another portion as the site of a prison. Well, that's grim. They're gonna put a cemetery and a prison in this new colony. First things first, right? Anyway, in accordance with this rule, it may safely be assumed that the forefathers of Boston had built the first prison house somewhere in the vicinity of Cornhill. door looked more antique than anything else in the New World. Like all that pertains to crime, it seemed to have never known a youthful era. Before this ugly edifice, and between it and the wheel track of the street, was a grass plot much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, apple barrel, and such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenial in the soil that had so early borne the black flower of civilized society, a prison. But on one side of the portal and rooted almost at the threshold was a wild rose bush covered in this month of June with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. This rose bush, by a strange chance, has been kept alive in history, but whether it had merely survived out of the stern old wilderness so long after the fall of the gigantic pines and oaks that originally overshadowed it, or whether, as there is fair authority for believing it had sprung up under the footsteps of the Saint Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door, we shall not take upon us to determine. Okay, I'm going to read that again. This rose bush, by a strange chance, has been kept alive in history, but whether it merely survived out of the stern old wilderness so long after the fall of the gigantic pines and oaks that originally overshadowed it, or whether, as there is fair authority for believing it had sprung up under the footsteps of the Saint Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door, we shall not take upon us to determine. Finding it so directly on the threshold of our narrative, which is now about to issue from that inauspicious portal, we can hardly do otherwise than pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. It may serve, let us hope, to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. Okay, so it's a very short chapter, right? Chapter 2 looks like it's about a regular length. Chapter 3. Yep, so the rest of these are pretty normal. Okay, so just to recap chapter 1 before we get into chapter 2, because I am going to summarize each chapter, and I'm also going to put multiple chapters together for this book because they're kind of short, and I want to have some length in my videos because it seems to be what people want. Okay, so chapter 1 summary. In that, just those 2 pages, Hawthorne foreshadows the tone of the novel, which is, darkness, human frailty, the gloominess of the Puritan life, and introduces us to the Puritan society of the early 17th century, which is the year 1642, in Boston, Massachusetts. He paints this dark picture by opening the story with several chastely and boringly dressed Puritans gathered around an old, worn-out wooden prison. And he makes mention of, weeds nearby and a singular wild rose bush in their midst. Hawthorne discusses many themes and makes use of symbolism to further emphasize and express his own views of the life of his Puritan ancestors, which, by the way, the story before the jail in Prison Lane on a certain summer morning not less than 2 centuries ago was occupied by a pretty large number of the inhabitants of Boston, all with their eyes intently fastened on the iron-clamped oaken door. Among any other population, or at a later period in the history of New England, the grim rigidity that petrified the bearded physiognomies of these good people would have augured some awful business in hand. So physiognomy means a person's facial features or expression, especially when regarded as characteristic of that person. The supposed art of judging character from facial characteristics, a word where physiognomy was a respected practice, the general form or appearance of something. I think that's the definition that applies. The general form or appearance of these good people would have augured of an event or circumstance portend a good or bad outcome. The end of the Cold War seemed to augur well, turn out well. So augured means like turn out well, or whether it's a good or whether it was a good or bad outcome, a specified outcome. Foresee or predict would have foreseen or predict some awful business in hand. So they're just letting us know that the setting of the people was definitely indicating that there was something sad and, in front of the prison happening, right? It could have betokened nothing short of anticipated execution of some noted culprit on whom the sentence of a legal tribunal had but confirmed the verdict of public sentiment. But in that early severity of the Puritan character, an inference of this kind could not so indubitably be drawn. It might be that a sluggish bound servant or an undutiful child whom his parents had given over to the civil authority was to be corrected at the whipping post. It might be that an antinomian, a Quaker, or other heterodox religionist was to be scourged out of town, or an idle and vagrant native. Vagrant means kind of like homeless, by the way. Vagrant native whom the white man's firewater had made notorious about the streets into the shadow of the forest. It might be, too, that a witch, like old Mistress Hibbins, the bitter-tempered widow of the magistrate, was to die upon the gallows. In either case, there was very much that same solemnity of demeanor on the part of the spectators as befitted a people among whom religion and law were almost identical, and in whose character both were so thoroughly interfused that the mildest and severest acts of public discipline were alike made venerable and awful. Meager indeed and cold was the sympathy that a transgressor might look for from such bystanders at the scaffold. On the other hand, a penalty which in our days would infer a degree of mocking infamy and ridicule might then be invested with almost as stern a dignity as the punishment of death itself. It was a circumstance to be noted on the summer morning when our story begins its course, that the women, of whom there were several in the crowd, appeared to take a peculiar interest in whatever penal infliction might be expected to ensue. The age had not so much refinement that any sense of impropriety restrained the wearers of the petticoat and farthingale from stepping forth into the public ways and wedging their not unsubstantial persons, if occasion were, into the throng nearest to the scaffold at an execution. Morally as well as materially, there was a coarser fibre in those wives and maidens of old English birth and breeding than in their fair descendants separated from them by a series of 6 or 7 generations, for throughout that chain of ancestry every successive mother has transmitted to her child a fainter bloom, a more delicate and briefer beauty, and a slighter physical frame, if not a character of less force and solidity than their own. The women who were now standing about the prison door stood within less than half a century of the period when the man like Elizabeth had been the not altogether unsuitable representative of the sex. They were her countrywomen, startle us at the present day, whether in respect to its purport or its volume of tone. Good wives, said a hard-featured dame of 50, I'll tell ye a piece of my mind. It would be greatly for the public boove if we women, being of mature age and church members in good repute, should have the handling of such malefactresses as this Hester Prynne. Malefactress. So malefactress is just like a way to describe a woman, criminal. As this Hester Prynne, what think ye, gossips, if the hussy stood up for judgment before us five that are now here in a knot together, would she come off with such a sentence as the worshipful magistrates have awarded? Marry, I trow not. People say, said another, that the Reverend Master Dimsdale, her godly pastor, takes it very grievously to heart that such a scandal should have come upon his congregation. The magistrates are God-fearing gentlemen, but merciful overmuch. That is the truth, added a third audible matron. At the very least, they should have put the brand on a hot iron on Hester Prynne's forehead. Madam Hester would have winced at that. I warrant me, but she, the naughty baggage, little will she care what they put upon the bodice of her gown. Why, look you, she may cover it with a brooch or such like heathenish adornment, and so walk the streets as brave as ever. Ah, but, interposed more softly a young wife holding a child by the hand, let her cover the mark as she will, the pang of it will always be in her heart. What do we talk of marks and brands, whether on the bodice of her gown or the flesh of her forehead? Cried another female, the ugliest as well as the most. Pitiless of these self-constituted judges, this woman has brought shame upon us all, and ought to die. Is there not law for it? Truly there is, both in the scripture and the statute book. Then let the magistrates who have made it of no effect think themselves if their own wives and daughters go astray. Mercy on us, good wife, exclaimed a man in the crowd. Is there no virtue in woman save that springs from a wholesome fear of the gallows? That is the hardest word yet. Hush now, gossips, for the lock is turning in the prison door, and here comes Mistress Prynne herself. The door of the jail being flung open from within, then there appeared in the first place, like black shadow emerging into sunshine, the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle, with a sword by his side and his staff of office in his hand. This personage prefigured and represented his aspect the whole dismal severity of the Puritanic code of law, which it was his business to administer in its final and closest application to the offender. Stretching forth the official staff in his left hand, he laid the right upon the shoulder of a young woman whom he thus drew forward until on the threshold of the prison door she repelled him by an action marked with natural dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air as if by her own free will. She bore in her arms a child, a baby of some 3 months old, who winked and turned aside its little face from the too vivid light of the day, because its existence therefore had brought it acquainted only with the great twilight of a dungeon. Or other darksome apartment of the prison. When the young woman, the mother of the child, stood fully revealed before the ground, it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom, not so much by an impulse of motherly affection as that she might thereby conceal a certain token which was wrought or fastened into her dress. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would but poorly serve to hide another, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and yet a haughty smile and a glance that would not be abashed, looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. On the breast of her gown, in the fine red cloth surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with so dark and abundant hair so glossy that it threw off the sunshine with a gleam, and a face which, besides being beautiful from regularity of feature and richness of complexion, had the impressiveness belonging to a marked brow and deep black eyes. She was ladylike too, after the manner of the feminine gentility of those days, characterized by a certain state and dignity rather than by the delicate, evanescent, and indescribable grace which is now recognized as its indication. And never had Esther Prynne appeared more ladylike in the antique interpretation of the term. Then, as she issued from the prison, those who had known her before known her, and had expected to behold her dimmed by disastrous cloud, were astonished and even startled to perceive how her beauty shone out and made a halo of the misfortune and ignominy in which she was enveloped. It may be true that to a sensitive observer there was something exquisitely painful in it. Her attire, which indeed she had wrought for the occasion in prison and had modeled much after her own fancy, seemed to express the attitude of her spirit, the desperate recklessness of her mood, by its wild and picturesque peculiarity, but the point which drew all eyes, as it were, transfigured the wearer, so that both men and women who had been familiarly acquainted with Esther Prynne were now impressed that, as if they beheld her for the first time, was that Scarlet Letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. She hath good skill at her needle, that's certain, remarked one of the female spectators. But did ever a woman before this brazen hussy contrive such a way of showing it? Why, gossips, what is it but to laugh in the faces of our godly magistrates and make a pride out of what they, worthy gentlemen, meant for punishment? It were well, muttered the most iron-visaged of the old dames, if we stripped Madame Esther's rich gown off her dainty shoulders, and as for the red letter which she had stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of mine own rheumatic flannel to make her a fitter one. Oh, peace, neighbors, peace, whispered their youngest companion. Do not let her hear you, not a stitch in that embroidered letter, but she has felt it in her heart. The grim beadle now made a gesture with his staff. Make way, good people, make way, in the king's name, cried he. Open a passage, and I promise ye, Mistress Prynne shall be set where man, woman, and child may have a fair sight of her brave apparel from this time till an hour past meridian. A blessing on the righteous colony of the Massachusetts, where iniquity is dragged into the sunshine. Come along, Madame Esther, and show your Scarlet Letter in the marketplace. A lane was forthwith opened through the crowd of spectators, preceded by the beadle and attended by an irregular procession of stern-browed men and unkindly-visaged women. Esther Prynne set forth towards the place appointed for her punishment. A crowd of eager and curious schoolboys, understanding little of the matter in hand, except that it gave them a half-holiday, ran before her progress, turning their heads continually to stare into her face and at the winkling baby in her arms and at the ignominious letter on her breast. It was no great distance in those days from the prison door to the marketplace. Measured by the prisoner's experience, however, it might be reckoned a journey of some length, for, haughty as her demeanor was, she perchance underwent an agony from every footstep of those that thronged to see her, as if her heart had been flung into the street for them all to spurn and trample on. In her nature, however, there is a provision alike marvelous and merciful, that the sufferer should never know the intensity of what he endures by its present torture, but chiefly by the pang that rankles after it. With almost a serene deportment, therefore, Esther Prynne passed through this portion of her ordeal and came to a sort of scaffold at the western extremity of the marketplace. It stood nearly beneath the caves of Boston's earliest church and appeared to be a fixture there. In fact, the scaffold constituted a portion of a penal machine which now, for 2 or 3 generations past, has been merely historical and traditionary among us, but was held in the old time to be as effectual as an agent in the promotion of good citizenship as ever was the guillotine among the terrorists of France. essence of this punishment to do. In Hester Prynne's instance, however, as not unfrequently in other cases, her sentence here that she should stand a certain time upon the platform, but without undergoing that gripe about the neck and confinement of the head, the proneness to which was the most devilish characteristic of this ugly engine. Knowing well her part, she ascended a flight of wooden steps, and was thus displayed to the surrounding multitude at about the height of a man's shoulders above the street. Had there been a Papist among the crowd of Puritans, he might have seen in this beautiful woman, so picturesque in her attire and mien, and with the infant in her bosom, an object to remind him of the image of divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent. Something which should remind him, indeed, but only by contrast, of that sacred image of sinless motherhood whose infant was to redeem the world. Here there was the taint of deepest sin and the most sacred quality of human life, working such effect that the world was only the darker for this woman's beauty, and the more lost for the infant than she had borne. The scene was not without a mixture of awe, such as must always invest the spectacle of guilt and shame in a fellow creature, before society shall have grown corrupt enough to smile instead of shuddering at it. The witnesses of Hester Prynne's disgrace had not yet passed beyond their simplicity. They were stern enough to look upon her death that had been the sentence without a murmur at its severity. But had none of the heartlessness of another social state, which would find only a theme for jest in an exhibition like the present, even had there been a disposition to turn the matter into ridicule, it must have been repressed and overpowered by the solemn presence of men no less dignified than the governor and several of his councillors, a judge, a general, and the ministers of the town, all of whom sat or stood in a balcony of the meeting house, looking down upon the platform, when such personages could constitute a part of the spectacle without risking the majesty or reverence of rank and office. It was safely to be inferred that the infliction of a legal sentence would have an earnest and effectual meaning. Accordingly, the crowd was somber and grave. The unhappy culprit sustained herself as best a woman might under the heavy weight of 1,000 unrelenting eyes, all fastened upon her and concentrated at her bosom. Down upon the ground, or else she go mad at once. Yet there were intervals when the whole scene in which she was the most conspicuous object seemed to vanish from her eyes, or at least glimmered indistinctly before them like a mass of imperfectly shaped and spectral images. Her mind, and especially her memory, was preternaturally active and kept bringing up the other scenes than this roughly honed street of a little town on the edge of the western wilderness. Other faces then were lowering upon her from beneath the brims of those steeple ground hats, reminiscences, the most trifling and immaterial passages of infancy and school days, sports, childish quarrels, and the little domestic traits of her maiden years came swarming back upon her, intermingled with recollections of whatever was gravest in her subsequent life. One picture precisely as vivid as another, as if all were of similar importance, or all alike a play. Possibly it was an instinctive device of her spirit to relieve itself by the exhibition of these phantasmagoric forms from the cruel weight and hardness of the reality. But be that as it might, the scaffold of the pillory was a point of view that revealed to Hester Prynne the entire track along which she had been treading since her happy infancy. Standing on that miserable eminence, she saw again her native village in Old England, and her paternal home, a decayed house of grey stone with a poverty-stricken aspect, but retaining a half-obliterated shield of arms over the portal in token of antique gentility. She saw her father's face with its bald brow and reverend white beard that flowed from the old-fashioned Elizabethan ruff, her mother's too, with the look of a heedful and anxious love which always wore in her remembrance, and which even since her death had so often laid the impediment of a gentle remonstrance in her daughter's pathway. She saw her own face glowing with girlish beauty and illuminating all the interior of the dusky mirror in which she had been wont to gaze at it. There she beheld another countenance of a man well stricken in years, flowers, a pale, thin, scholar-like visage with eyes dim and bleared by the lamplight that she had served them to pour over any ponderous books. Yet those same bleared optics had a strange, penetrating power when it was their owner's purpose to read the human soul. This figure of the study in the cloister, as Hester Prynne's womanly fancy failed not to recall, was slightly deformed with her left shoulder a trifle higher than the right. Next rose before her in memory's picture gallery the intricate and narrow thoroughfares, the tall grey houses, the huge cathedrals, and the public edifices, ancient in date and quaint in architecture of a continental city where a new life had awaited her, still in connection with the misshapen scholar, a new life but feeding itself on time-worn materials like a tuft of green moss on a crumbling wall. Lastly, in lieu of these shifting scenes, came back the rude marketplace of the Puritan settlement, with all the townspeople assembled, and leveling their stern regards at Hester Prynne, yes, at herself, who stood on the scaffold of the pillory, an infant in her arm, and the letter A in scarlet fantastically embroidered with gold thread upon her bosom. Could it be true? She clutched the child so fiercely to her breast that it sent forth a cry. She turned her eyes downward at the scarlet letter, and even touched it with her finger to assure herself that the infant and the shame were real. Yes, these were her realities. All else had vanished. Okay, now for Chapter 2 summary, and then Chapter 3. Chapter 2 opens with Puritan women, that have or who have holier than thou attitudes. They're maliciously and unsympathetically discussing Hester Prynne and her sin of adultery. She is sentenced by the puritanical law to stand in front of the onlookers with the letter A ornately embroidered on her chest to publicly acknowledge her sin before the colony. The beadle leads her through the crowd to the scaffold. She is holding her infant Pearl, who is the offspring created by the adulterous affair, and symbolizes Hester's sin along with the scarlet letter A. While on one hand, Pearl is a permanent scar of her sin, but on the other hand, Pearl is a product of forbidden love. However, though this act is socially ostracized, she is still a product of an act of love nonetheless. So naturally, Pearl is a bit of a rebel. As she was born out of rebellion, this love affair being intolerable in the Puritan code and society. We can see there Hawthorne's criticism of the harsh values of his ancestors, and perhaps maybe they are going a little too far while calling the kettle black, if that makes sense. I think if the Bible verse, "Let him without sin cast the first stone," I personally feel this was possibly what Hawthorne was trying to express. Let me know what you think in the comments. Hawthorne uses Hester also as an image of beauty in a dark and dreary scene. And Roger Chillingworth, while we don't quite know the relationship between Hester and the Reverend, we do get the comment from one of the gossips noting the Reverend was grief-stricken over the impact this will have on his congregation. As far as Roger Chillingworth, we don't get his name yet, but we get a full characterization through Hester's thoughts or recollections of him while on the scaffold. So Chapter 2 portrays Hawthorne's attitude toward the Puritan society, as we briefly touched on. He paints a picture of the self-righteous and smug attitude of the women gathered to condemn Hester for going against their pious culture. He refers to them as gossips who are quite frightening in their harshness towards Hester. We hear one of them suggest she should be branded with a hot iron on her forehead, stamping as it was her comment. However, it is important to note that this young wife is somewhat still complicit to the pious ways by bringing her child along to witness the punishment, teaching the next generation that this is okay. Now, Hawthorne employs a somewhat heavy historical narrative writing style in this chapter while occasionally commenting on his views. He also uses symbolism to communicate as well, such as the beetle, the Scarlet Letter A, and Pearl. As a matter of fact, we can identify many of the novel's themes through his use of imagery and symbols found in the characters, the scenery, physical objects, and larger social issues of the time. For example, the beetle represents religious authority, which in the society also meant social authority. His persona is grim and grisly and identifies him as being complicit with the social norms of the society of which he is a part. As the novel progresses, we see the relationship between Pearl and the Scarlet Letter A develop, as well as more meaning embedded in the symbolism of Pearl and the letter A. And this brings us to chapter 3. Yay! Let's go. Alright, so chapter 3. The recognition. Let's see what we got going on here. Okay. Alright, perfect. Okay. From this intense consciousness of being the object of severe and universal observation, the wearer of the Scarlet Letter was at length relieved by discerning on the outskirts of the crowd a figure which irresistibly took possession of her thoughts. A native, in his native attire, was standing there, but the red men were not so infrequent visitors of the English settlements that one of them would have attracted any notice from Hester Prynne at such a time. Much less would he have excluded all other objects and ideas from her mind. By the native side, and evidently sustaining a companionship with him, stood a white man, clad in a strange disarray of civilized and savage costume. He was small in stature with a furrowed visage, which as of yet could hardly be termed age. There was a remarkable intelligence in his features, as of a person who had cultivated his mental part, that it could not fail to mold the physical to itself, and become manifest by unmistakable tokens. Although by a seemingly careless arrangement of his heterogeneous garb, he had endeavored to conceal or abate the peculiarity, it was sufficiently evident to Hester Prynne that one of this man's shoulders rose higher than the other. Again, at the first instant of perceiving that thin visage and the slight deformity of the figure, she pressed her infant to her bosom with so convulsive a force that the poor babe uttered another cry of pain, but the mother did not seem to hear it. There we go. At his arrival in the marketplace, and some time before she saw him, the stranger had been his eyes on Hester Prynne. It was carelessly at first, like a man chiefly accustomed to look inward, and to whom external matters are of little value and import unless they bear relation to something within his mind. Very soon, however, his look became keen and penetrative. A writhing horror twisted itself across his features like a snake gliding swiftly over them and making one little pause with all its wreathed intervolutions in open sight. His face darkened with some powerful emotion which, nevertheless, he was so instantaneously controlled by an effort of his will that, save at a single moment, its expression might have passed for calmness. After a brief space, the compulsion grew almost imperceptible and finally subsided into the depths of his nature. that she appeared to recognize him, he slowly and calmly raised his finger, made a gesture with it in the air, and set it on his lips. Then, touching the shoulder of a townsman who stood next to him, he addressed him in a formal and courteous manner. "I pray you, good sir," said he, who is this woman, and wherefore is she here set up to a public shame?" "You must needs be a stranger in this region, friend," answered the townsman, looking curiously at the questioner and his savage native companion. "Else you would surely have heard of Mistress Hester Prynne and her evil doings. She hath raised a great scandal, I promise you, in godly Master Dimmesdale's church." "You say truly," replied the other. "I am a stranger." "You say truly," replied the other. "I am a stranger, and have been a wanderer sorely against my will. I have met with grievous mishaps by the sea, and have been long held in bonds among the heathen folk to the southward, and am now brought hither by this native to be redeemed out of my captivity. Will it please yon, therefore, to tell me of Hester Prynne's, have I heard her name rightly, of this woman's offences, and what has brought her to yonder scaffold?" "Truly, friend, and methinks it must gladden your heart, after your troubles and sojourn in the wilderness," said the townsman, "to find yourself at length in a land where iniquity is searched out and punished in the sight of rulers and people, as here in our godly New England. Yonder woman, sir, you must know, was the wife of a certain learned man, English by birth, but who had long dwelt in Amsterdam, whence, some good time gone, he was minded to cross over and cast in his lot with us of the Massachusetts. To this purpose he sent his wife before him, remaining himself to look after some necessary affairs. Marry, good sir, in some 2 years or less that the woman has been a dweller here in Boston. No tidings have come of this learned gentleman, Master Prynne, and his young wife, look you, being left to her own misguidance." "I conceive you," said the stranger with a bitter smile. "So learned a man as you speak of should have learned this too in his books, and who by your favour, sir, may be the father of yonder babe. It is some 3 or 4 months old, I should judge, which Mistress Prynne is holding in her arms. Of a truth, friend, that matter remaineth a riddle, and the Daniel who shall expound it is yet a wanting," answered the townsman. "Madam Hester absolutely refuseth to speak, and the magistrates have laid their heads together in vain. Peradventure the guilty one stands looking on at this sad spectacle, unknown of man, and forgetting that God sees him." "The learned man," observed the stranger with another smile, "should come himself to look into the mystery. It behooves him well if he be still in life," responded the townsman. "Now, good sir, our Massachusetts magistracy, bethinking themselves that this woman is youthful and fair, and doubtless was strongly tempted to her fall, and that moreover, as is most likely, her husband may be at the bottom of the sea, they have not been bold to put in force the extremity of our righteous law against her. The penalty thereof is death, but in their great mercy and tenderness of heart, they have doomed Mistress Prynne to stand only a space of 3 hours on the platform of the pillory, and then and thereafter for the remainder of her natural life to wear a mark of shame upon her bosom." "A wise sentence," remarked the stranger, gravely bowing his head. "Then she will be a living sermon against sin until the ignominious letter be engraved upon her tombstone. It irks me, nevertheless, that the partner of her iniquity should not at least stand on the scaffold by her side. But he will be known, he will be known, oh, he will be known." He bowed courteously to the communicative townsman, and whispering a few words to his native attendant, they both made their way through eruption, all other objects in the visible world seemed to vanish, leaving only him and her. Such an interview perhaps would have been more terrible than even to meet him as she now did, with the hot midday sun burning down. With the hot midday sun burning down upon her face and lighting up its shame, with the scarlet token of infamy on her breast, with the sin-born infant of her arms, with the whole people drawn forth as to a festival, staring at the features that should have been seen only in the quiet gleam of the fireside, in the happy shadow of a home, or beneath the matronly well at church. Dreadful as it was conscious of a shelter in the presence of these 1,000 witnesses. It was better to stand thus with so many betwixt him and her than to greet him face to face, they two alone. She fled for refuge, as it were, to the public exposure, and dreaded the moment when its protection should be withdrawn from her. Involved in these thoughts, she scarcely heard a voice behind her until it repeated her name more than once in a loud and solemn tone, audible to the whole multitude. "Hearken unto me, Hester Prynne," said the voice. It has already been noticed that directly over the platform on which Hester Prynne stood was a kind of balcony or open gallery appended to the meeting house, attached to the meeting house. It was the place whence proclamations were wont to be made, amidst an assemblage of the magistracy, with all the ceremonial that attended such public observances in those days. Here, to witness the scene which we are describing, sat Governor Bellingham himself, with 4 sergeants about his chair, bearing halberds as a guard of honor. He wore a dark feather in his hat, a border of embroidery on his cloak, and a black velvet tunic beneath. A gentleman advanced in years, with a hard experience written in his wrinkles. He was not ill-fitted to be the head and representative of a community which owed its origin and progress, and its present state of development, not to the impulses of youth, but to the stern and tempered energies of manhood, and the somber sagacity of age, accomplishing so much precisely because it imagined and hoped so little. The other eminent characters by whom the chief ruler was surrounded were distinguished by a dignity of men belonging to a period when the forms of authority were felt to possess the sacredness of divine institutions. They were doubtless good men, just and sage, but out of the whole human family it would not have been easy to elect the same number of wise and virtuous persons who should be less capable of sitting in judgment on an erring woman's heart and disentangling its mesh of good and evil than the sages of rigid aspect towards whom Hester Prynne now turned her face. She seemed conscious indeed that whatever sympathy she might expect lay in the larger and warmer heart of the multitude, for as she lifted her eyes toward the balcony, the unhappy woman grew pale and trembled. The voice which had called her attention was that of the Reverend and famous John Wilson, the eldest clergyman of Boston. A great scholar, like most of his contemporaries in the profession, and withal a man of kind and genial spirit. This last attribute, however, had been less carefully developed than his intellectual gifts, and was in truth rather a matter of shame than self-congratulation with him. There he stood, with a border of grizzled locks beneath his skull cap, while his gray eyes, accustomed to the shaded light of his study, were winking like those of Hester's infant in the unadulterated sunshine. He looked like the darkly engraved portraits which we see prefixed to old volumes of sermons, and had no more right than one of those portraits would have to step forth, as he now did, and meddle with a question of human guilt, passion, and anguish. "Hester Prynne," said the clergyman, I have striven with my young brother here, under whose preaching persuade this godly youth that he should deal with you here in the face of heaven and before these wise and upright rulers, and in hearing of all the people, as touching the vileness and blackness of your sin. Knowing your natural temper better than I, he could the better judge what arguments to use, whether of tenderness or terror, such as might prevail over your hardness and obstinacy, in so much that you should no longer hide the name of him who tempted you to this grievous fall. But he opposes to me with a young man's oversoftness, albeit wise beyond his years, that it were wronging the very nature of woman to force her to lay open her heart's secrets in such broad daylight and in presence of so great a multitude. Truly, as I sought to convince him, the shame lay in the commission of the sin and not in the showing of it forth. What say you to it? Once again, Brother Dimmesdale, must it be thou or I that shall deal with you, with this poor sinner's soul? There was a murmur among the dignified and reverend occupants of the balcony, and Governor Bellingham gave expression to its purport, speaking in an authoritative voice, although tempered with respect, towards the youthful clergyman whom he addressed. Good Master Dimmesdale, said he, the responsibility of this woman's soul lies greatly with you. It behooves you, therefore, to exhort her to repentance and to confession as a proof and consequences thereof. The directness of this appeal drew the eyes of the whole crowd upon the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, a young clergyman who had come from one of the great English universities, bringing all the learning of the age into our wild forest land. His eloquence and religious fervor had already given the earnest of high eminence in his profession. He was a person of very striking aspect, with a white, lofty, and impending brow, large, brown, and forcibly compressed. It was apt to be tremulous, expressive, expressing both nervous sensibility and a vast power of self-restraint. Notwithstanding his high native gifts and scholar-like attainments, there was an air about this young minister, an apprehensive, a startled, a half-frightened look, as of a being who felt himself quite astray and at a loss in the pathway of human existence. And therefore, so far as his duties would permit, he trod in the shadowy bypaths, and thus kept himself simple and childlike, coming forth when occasion was, with a freshness and fragrance and dewy purity of thought, which, as many people said, affected them like the speech of an angel. Such was the young man whom the Reverend Mr. Wilson and the Governor had introduced so openly to the public notice, bidding him speak in the hearing of all men to that mystery of a woman's soul, so sacred even in its pollution. The trying nature of his position drove the blood from his cheek and made his lips tremulous. Hester Prynne, said he, leaning over the balcony and looking down steadfastly into her eyes, thou hearest what this good man says, and seest the accountability under which I labor. If thou feelest it to be for thy soul's peace, and that thy earthly punishment will be made more effectual to salvation, I charge thee to speak out the name of thy fellow sinner and fellow sufferer. Be not silent from any mistaken pity and tenderness for him, for believe me, Hester, though he were to step down from a high place and stand there beside thee on thy pedestal of shame, yet better were it so than to hide a guilty heart through life. What can thy silence do for him, except it tempt him, yea, compel him, as it were, to add hypocrisy to sin? Heaven hath granted thee an open ignominy, that thereby thou mayest work out an open triumph over the evil within voice was tremulously sweet, rich, deep, and broken. The feeling that it so evidently manifested rather than the direct purport of the words caused it to vibrate within all hearts, and brought the listeners into one accord of sympathy. Even the poor baby at Esther's bosom was affected by the same influence, for it directed its hitherto vacant gaze towards Mr. Dimmesdale and held up its little arms with a half-pleased, half-plaintive murmur. So powerful seemed the minister's appeal that the people could not believe but that Esther Prynne would speak out the guilty name, or else that the guilty one himself, in whatever high or lowly place he stood, would be drawn forth by an inward and inevitable necessity, and compelled to ascend the scaffold. Esther shook her head. "Woman, transgress not beyond the limits of heaven's mercy," cried the Reverend Wilson, more harshly than before. "That little babe hath been gifted with a voice to second and confirm the counsel which thou hast heard. Speak out the name, that in thy repentance may avail to take the scarlet letter off thy breast." "Never," replied Esther Prynne, looking not at Mr. Wilson, but into the deep and troubled eyes of the young clergyman. "It is too deeply branded. Ye cannot take it off, and would that I might endure his agony as well as mine." "Speak, woman," said another voice, coldly and sternly, proceeding from the crowd about the scaffold. "Speak, and give your child a father." "I will not speak," answered Esther, turning pale as death, but responding to this voice, which she too surely recognized. "And my child must seek a heavenly father. She shall never know an earthly one." "She will not speak," murmured Mr. Dimmesdale, who, leaning over the balcony with his hand upon his heart, had awaited the result of his appeal. He now drew back with a long respiration. Wondrous strength and generosity of a woman's heart. "She will not speak." Discerning the impracticable state of the poor culprit's mind, and the elder clergyman, who had carefully prepared himself for the occasion, addressed to the multitude a discourse on sin in all its branches, but with continual reference to the ignominious letter. So forcibly did he dwell upon this symbol for the hour or more during which his periods were rolling over the people's heads, that it assumed new terrors in their imagination, and seemed to derive its scarlet hue from the flames of the infernal pit. Esther Prynne, meanwhile, kept her place upon the pedestal of shame, with glazed eyes and an air of weary indifference. She had borne that morning all that nature could endure, and as her temperament was not of the order that escapes from too intense suffering by a swoon, her spirit could only shelter itself beneath a stony crust of insensibility, while the faculties of animal life remained entire. In this state, the voice of the preacher thundered remorselessly but unavailingly upon her ears. The infant, during the latter portion of her ordeal, pierced the air with its wailings and screams. She strove to hush it mechanically, but seemed scarcely to sympathize with its trouble. With the same hard demeanor, she was led back to prison and vanished from the public gaze within its iron-clamped portal. It was whispered by those who peered after her that the scarlet letter threw a lurid gleam along the dark passageway of the interior. So this brings us to chapter 3's summary. Okay, so here we are introduced to a physically deformed stranger who is lurking just beyond the crowd. Esther notices him and hugs Pearl tightly, who is crying. The man is a newcomer to Boston, yet recognizes Esther and is horrified. He asks a man in the crowd about what is happening and finds out Esther has committed the crime of adultery, and her punishment is to stand on the scaffold for 3 hours and wear the letter A embroidered on her clothing for the rest of her life. In this conversation, also learn of the Reverend Dimsdale's desire for her to reveal the Father, which is him, and lacks the courage to admit it, given that he is supposed to be responsible for her moral behavior as leader of the church. It's as if he wished she would, so he wouldn't have to, but that way he could absolve himself of the guilt that he's feeling and rightfully stand next to her on the scaffold. We also meet his relative, Reverend Mr. Wilson, who sternly demands Esther tell the crowd who he is. This relative demands Dimsdale to admonish Esther to reveal her partner in sin. Despite Dimsdale's eager and heartfelt plea with Esther, despite the Reverend Wilson's pious demands and also ignoring the stranger in the crowd's stern remarks, she adamantly refuses. Reverend Wilson gives a long and tedious sermon, after which Esther is led off of the scaffold back to the prison with a crying girl whom she has not been able to make stop. Okay, so in chapter 3 we are introduced to two more main characters, the deformed stranger and Reverend Dimsdale. Chapter 3 sets the stage for the tensions that arise among these characters throughout the rest of the story. The deformity in the stranger, who calls himself a Roger Chillingworth, it may symbolize the evil in his own soul. Excuse me. More of Reverend Dimsdale's character is revealed through his one-paragraph speech, as opposed to any physical characteristics or nervous habits. Knowing he is Esther's lover and father of Pearl, his speech is full of double meaning. While trying to convince the public by publicly chastising her, he is also hoping that at the same time she will reveal his name, because he is too morally weak, meaning he's not strong enough to take the punishment and ridicule to admit it, but feels the guilt watching her take the punishment alone. He asks Esther to make him accountable, but cannot make himself accountable. However, he was her lover and feels shame and blame for the horrible situation she is in. He tells her by revealing his name she will be able to find peace and salvation for her soul, but also is privately pleading with her to reveal the name so his salvation could be achieved, because without public repentance, salvation is unattainable. He acknowledges in his reprimand that this individual is better off to step down from his high place and stand beside her, referring to himself actually. That brings us to chapter 4. Yay. Okay, so let's just get right into it. So after her return to the prison, Esther Prynne was found to be in a state of nervous excitement that demanded constant watchfulness, lest she should perpetrate violence on herself or do some half-frenzied mischief to the poor babe. As night approached, it proving impossible to quell her insubordination by rebuke or threats of punishment, Master Brackett, the jailer, thought it fit to introduce a physician. He described him as a man of skill in all Christian modes of physical science and likewise familiar with whatever the savage people could teach in respect to medicinal herbs and roots that grew in the forest. To say the truth, there was much need of professional the most convenient and suitable mode of disposing of him. Until the magistrates should have conferred with the native sagamores respecting his ransom. Well, now that's sounding familiar from the last story we read. Okay. His name was announced as Roger Chillingworth. The jailer, after ushering him into the room, remained a moment marveling at the comparative quiet that followed his entrance. For Hester Prynne had immediately become as still as death, although the child continued to moan. "Prithee, friend, leave me alone with my patient," said the practitioner. "Trust me, good jailer, you shall briefly have peace in your house, and I promise you Mistress Prynne shall hereafter be more amenable to just authority than you may have found her heretofore." "Nay, if your worship can accomplish that," answered Master Brackett, "I shall own you for a man of skill indeed. Verily the woman hath been like a possessed one, and there lacks little that I should take in hand to drive Satan out of her with stripes." The stranger had entered the room with the characteristic quietude of the profession to which he announced himself as belonging, nor did his demeanor change when the withdrawal of the prison keeper left him face to face with the woman whose absorbed notice of him in the crowd had intimated so close a relation between himself and her. His first care was given to the child, whose cries, indeed, as she lay writhing on the trundle bed, made it of peremptory necessity to postpone all other business to the task of soothing her. He examined the infant carefully and then proceeded to unclasp a leathern case which he took from beneath his dress. It appeared to contain medical preparations, one of which he mingled with a cup of water. "My old studies in alchemy," observed he, "and my sojourn for above a year past among a people well versed in the kindly properties of symbols, have made a better physician of me than many that claim the medical degree. Here, woman, the child is yours. She is none of mine. Either will she recognize my voice or aspect as a father's. Administer this draught, therefore, with thine own hand." Hester repelled the offered medicine, at the same time gazing with strongly marked apprehension into his face. "Wouldst thou avenge thyself on the innocent babe?" whispered she. "Foolish woman," responded the physician, half coldly, half soothingly. "What should ail me to harm this misbegotten and miserable babe? The medicine is potent for her good, and were it my child, yea, mine own as well as thine, I could do no better for it." As she still hesitated, being in fact in no reasonable state of mind, he took the infant in his arms and himself administered the draught. It soon proved its efficacy and redeemed the leech's pledge. The moans of the little patient subsided, its convulsive tossings gradually ceased, and in a few moments, as is the custom of young children after relief from pain, it sank into a profound and dewy slumber. The physician, as he had a fair right to be termed, next bestowed his attention on the mother. With calm and intense scrutiny, he felt her pulse, looked into her eyes, a gaze that made her heart shrink and shudder because so familiar and yet so strange and cold, and finally satisfied with this investigation, proceeded to mingle another draught. "I know not let thee nor nepenthe thee," remarked he, "but I have learned many new secrets in the wilderness, and here is one of them, a recipe that a native taught me in requital of some lessons of my own, that were as old as Paracelsus. Drink it, it may be less soothing than a sinless conscience. That I cannot give thee, but it will calm the swell and heaving of thy passion like oil thrown on the waves of a tempestuous sea." He presented the cup to Hester, who received it with a slow, earnest look into his face, not precisely a look of fear, yet full of doubt and questioning as object to meet my eyes would be thyself, Hester Prynne, standing up, a statue of ignominy, before the people. Nay, from the moment when we came down the old church steps together, a married pair, I might have beheld the balefire of that Scarlet Letter blazing at the end of our path. Thou knowest, said Hester, for depressed as she was, she could not endure this last quiet stab at the token of her shame. Thou knowest that I was frank with thee. I felt no love, nor feigned any. True, replied he, it was my folly. I have sold it. I have said it. But up to that epoch of my life, I have lived in vain. The world had been so cheerless. My heart was a habitation large enough for many guests, but lonely and chill, and without a household fire. I longed to kindle one. It seemed so not so wild a dream, old as I was, and somber as I was, and misshapen as I was, that the simple bliss which is scattered far and wide for all mankind to gather up might yet be mine. And so, Hester, I drew thee into my heart, into its innermost chamber, and sought to warm thee by the warmth which thy presence made there. I have greatly wronged thee, murmured Hester. We have wronged each other, answered he. Mine was the first wrong, when I betrayed thy budding youth into a false and unnatural relation with my decay. Therefore, as a man who has not thought and philosophized in vain, I seek no vengeance, plot no evil against thee. Between thee and me the scale hangs fairly balanced. But Hester, the man lives, who has wronged us both. Who is he? Ask me not, replied Hester Prynne, looking firmly into his face, that thou shalt never know. Never sayest thou, rejoined he with a smile of dark and self-reliant intelligence. Never know him. Believe me, Hester, there are few things whether in the outward world or to a certain depth in the invisible sphere of thought, few things hidden from the man who devotes himself earnestly and unreservedly to the solution of a mystery. Thou mayst cover up thy secret from the prying multitude, thou mayst conceal it, too, from the ministers and magistrates, even as thou didst this day, when they sought to wrench the name out of thy heart and give thee a partner on thy pedestal. But as for me, I come to the inquest with other senses than they possess. I shall seek this man as I have sought truth in books, as I have sought gold in alchemy. There is a sympathy which that will make me conscious of him. I shall see him tremble. I shall feel myself shudder suddenly and unawares. Sooner or later he must needs be mine. The eyes of the wrinkled scholar glowed so intensely upon her that Hester Prynne clasped her hands over her heart, dreading lest he should read the secret there at once. Thou wilt not reveal his name, not the less he is mine, resumed he, with a look of confidence, as if destiny were at one with him. He bears no letter of infamy wrought into his garment, as thou dost, but I shall read it on his heart. Yet fear not for him. Think not that I shall interfere with heaven's own method of retribution, or to my own loss betray him to the gripe of human law. Neither do thou imagine that I shall contrive aught against his life, no, nor against his fame, if, as I judge, he be a man of fair repute. Let him live, let him hide himself in outward honor, if he may. Not the less he shall be mine. Thy acts are like mercy, said Hester, bewildered and appalled, but thy words interpret thee as a terror. One thing that wast my wife, I would enjoin upon thee, continued the scholar. Thou hast kept the secret of thy paramour, keep likewise mine. There are none in this land that know me. Breathe not to any human soul that thou didst ever call me husband. Here on this wild outskirt of the earth I shall pitch my tent, for elsewhere a wanderer and isolated from human interest, I find there a woman, a man, a child, amongst whom and myself there exist the closest ligaments. No matter whether of love or hate, no matter whether of right or wrong, thou and thine, Hester Prynne, belong to me. home is where thou art, and where he is, but betray me not. Wherefore dost thou desire it? Inquired Esther, shrinking. She hardly knew why, from his secret bond. Why not announce thyself openly and cast me off at once? It may be, he replied, because I will not encounter the dishonor that besmirches the husband of a faithless woman. It may be for the other reasons. Enough it is my purpose to live and die unknown. Let therefore thy husband be to the world as one already dead, and of whom no tidings shall ever come. Recognize me not by word, by sign, by look. Breathe not the secret above all. To the man thou wottest of, shouldst thou fail me in this, beware. His fame, his position, his life will be in my hands, beware. I will keep thy secret as I have this, said Esther. Swear it, rejoined he. And she took the oath. And now, Mistress Brand, said old Roger Chillingworth, as he was hereafter to be named, I leave thee alone with thy infant and the Scarlet Letter. How is it, Esther? Doth thy sentence bind thee to wear the token in thy sleep? Art thou not afraid of nightmares and hideous dreams? Why dost thou smile so at me? Inquired Esther, troubled at the expression of his eyes. Art thou like the black man that haunts the forest about us? Hast thou enticed me into a bond that will prove the ruin of my soul? Not thy soul, he answered with another smile. No, not thine. Chapter 4. Let's see, prison. Let's write up and read. Esther is in a state of see Roger Chillingworth and Esther for the evening and exchange dialogue about the sedatives he wants to give. She says it did at first. Chillingworth convinces her it's for the better. Perhaps giving them some medicine and he wants to sleep with mistress also. Something for her nerves as Chillingworth's doctor. They also talk about the affair, and Chillingworth admits his part for Puritan. They also talk about the affair. He was all altered and consumed. Studying and becoming a scholar, and neglected Esther who was in her prime. He says, I have betrayed thy budding youth into a false, unnatural relation with my decay. While he harbors no ill will towards Esther, he is determined to find out who the partner is and can bring him to justice. However, this will shape his character throughout the novel as to be a symbol of evil. So maybe he knows misplaced rage, perhaps. We also learn more about Esther's feelings for her husband, as opposed to Dimmesdale, whom she truly loves. Her deep concern for Dimmesdale's well-being is stronger than her sense of duty to her marriage. This is why she makes a promise to